The cold wind ran wild across the open land. Snow was falling again, slow at first, then heavy. The gray clouds touched the hills and hid the stars. The air was so cold that every breath looked like smoke. Ethan Cole rode his horse through that lonely winter night. His coat was worn and his hat was pulled low to keep the snow out of his eyes. The trail was quiet except for the crunch of hooves on the frozen ground. Ethan was a cowboy who lived alone. His small cabin stood miles from the nearest town, close to a narrow river and a few old cottonwood trees. He worked for himself, fixing fences, herding cattle for neighbors, and sometimes hunting in the hills. It was a hard life, but he liked it that way, quiet, honest, and far from noise or trouble. That evening he was returning home after a long day, checking fences before the storm grew worse. He knew these lands well, but something felt different tonight. The silence was too deep. The wind carried strange sounds, like the earth itself was waiting for something. He slowed his horse, listening. At first there was nothing. Then he heard it, a cry, not from an animal, a human voice. High, frightened, and far away, Ethan's body tensed. Someone was out there. He turned his horse sharply and rode toward the sound. The snow stung his face as he leaned forward in the saddle. The wind grew louder, but the cry came again, breaking through the storm. It was desperate. He reached the edge of a small forest where the land dipped low. There in the clearing he saw a broken wagon half covered in snow. One wheel had snapped off and the wood was splintered. Near it, two small figures crouched together, their arms around each other. For a moment he thought they were ghosts, pale shapes in the stormlight. But then one lifted her head and he saw her eyes. Real, alive, and full of fear. They were young girls, maybe 10 or 12, both wearing thin coats that were not made for such weather. Their hair was black, their faces pale with cold. Behind them, dark shapes moved through the snow. Wolves. A whole pack. Their eyes shone yellow in the gray light, and their growls rolled like thunder between the trees. Ethan didn't stop to think. He dropped from his horse and pulled his rifle from the saddle. "Stay down," he shouted. The girls didn't understand the words, but they stayed still, clutching each other tighter. Ethan fired once into the air. The loud crack echoed and the wolves froze. Then one snarled and leapt forward. Ethan aimed again and shot. The nearest wolf dropped, but the rest only backed away for a second. They were hungry and desperate. The storm had made hunting hard. He could see their ribs under their fur. They began to circle, moving slow and silent. The horse reared, frightened. Ethan stood between the girls and the pack, his boots deep in the snow. The wolves charged again. He fired 2 more shots, but there were too many. When the last bullet left the rifle, he drew his hunting knife and braced himself. A wolf jumped, teeth snapping. He met it mid-air, pushing the blade through its shoulder. It yelped and fell back. Another rushed from the side, biting at his arm, tearing his coat. He struck again, the blade flashing in the moonlight. He moved fast, every breath burning, his muscles screaming from the cold. He had faced wild horses before, even fought off a bear once, but this was different. These were a dozen hungry beasts in a storm, and he was only one man. Still, he refused to give up. He swung his arm wide, shouting to scare them off, fighting like every second was his last. The snow turned red in places, but he didn't stop. When the final wolf limped away, bleeding into the dark forest, Ethan could barely stand. His breath came in heavy gasps. His rifle hung empty at his side, and his knife dripped onto the snow. The wind was the only sound now. He turned and saw the girls still huddled behind the wagon. They stared at him as if they couldn't believe he was real. The older one's hand was bleeding where a wolf had grazed her skin. The younger girl's cheek had a thin scratch. They looked terrified but alive. Ethan walked to them slowly, his arm bleeding through his torn sleeve. "You're safe now," he said quietly. The older girl looked up at him, her lips trembling. She said something in Chinese, soft and quick. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood her eyes. She was thanking him. He tore a strip from his coat and tied it around her hand. His fingers shook from the cold, but he kept working until the bleeding stopped. Then he lifted both girls, one after another, onto his horse. They were light as feathers. He took the reins and began walking, leading the horse through the storm. The snow kept falling, but the wind had started to die down. After what felt like forever, he saw the faint shape of his cabin through the storm. The windows were dark. He pushed open the door and helped the girls inside. The cabin was small but warm once he lit the fire. He put wood on the flames until the light filled the room. The girls sat close together on the floor, shivering. He gave them water and a piece of bread from the shelf. They ate quietly, watching him the whole time as if afraid he would disappear. Once they stopped shaking, he tried to talk to them. He spoke slowly, using his hands. After a while, the older one began to understand a few words. She told him their names, Leon and May, and that they were traveling with their mother to a mining town a few days away. Their wagon broke when the trail turned icy. Their mother went to find help, but she never came back. The wolves found them first. Ethan listened without interrupting. He didn't know much about people from faraway lands, but he could see the same fear and hope in their faces that he'd seen in anyone who'd ever needed saving. When the story ended, he just nodded and said softly, "You're safe here." He gave them blankets and let them sleep near the fire. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin it was warm and calm. The two girls finally stopped crying and closed their eyes. Ethan sat by the window, his rifle across his lap even though it was empty. He watched the snow fall, thinking about their mother. Was she alive out there in the storm? Or lying frozen under a tree somewhere? He couldn't stop wondering. Hours passed. The fire cracked and the log shifted. The girls slept peacefully, their faces soft again under the orange glow. Ethan leaned back in his chair, tired but awake. He had no family of his own, no one waiting for him, but tonight he felt something different, like the quiet cabin wasn't so empty anymore. When dawn finally came, the storm had stopped. The world outside was white and still. The first light of morning touched the window and Ethan stood up. The girls were still sleeping, one small hand resting on his old coat. He smiled faintly. Then he went to the table, took a scrap of paper and wrote in his rough handwriting, "Stay inside. I'll find your mother." He put on his gloves, took his knife and his rifle and stepped outside. The air was freezing but clear. He looked back once at the cabin, the smoke from the chimney rising gently into the sky. Then he turned toward the forest and began to follow the broken trail of the wagon. Somewhere out there, a woman was lost and waiting, and Ethan Cole, the cowboy who had fought off her. The wind moved across the wide land like a sharp blade, carrying snow and dust together. The sky was gray, the color of frozen steel, and the land below looked endless. Ethan Cole rode his horse through that cold valley. He was a cowboy who had lived alone most of his life. His small cabin was miles away near the river bend, where the hills hid the last light of the sun. He had been checking the fence line since morning, but now the air grew heavy and he could smell a storm coming. The horse breathed hard, steam rising from its nose. Ethan adjusted his coat and patted the animal's neck. He was used to the silence of the land, but that evening the silence felt different. The sound of the wind seemed to carry something else, something alive. He stopped for a moment, listening. Then it came again, faint but sharp, a scream. It was not an animal. It was human. Without a second thought, Ethan turned his horse toward the sound. He rode fast across the snowy ground, his boots tight in the stirrups. The trees came closer, their black shapes breaking the white field. Then he saw it, a broken wagon lying on its side near the edge of the woods. One wheel was missing and the trail showed it had slipped on ice before falling. Beside it, two small figures were crouched together. Ethan's heart jumped. They were girls, maybe 10 or 12 years old. Their clothes were torn, their faces pale from cold. Before he could reach them, a low growl came from the shadows. He saw eyes, many pairs of eyes shining from the dark. Wolves, a hungry pack circling slow, waiting for the right moment. Ethan's rifle came off his shoulder in one motion. He fired once into the air. The echo ran through the hills. Some wolves stopped, but they didn't leave. The pack was desperate. The storm had kept food scarce. One of them moved forward, its teeth flashing white. Ethan aimed again and fired. The wolf dropped, but two more came closer. The girls screamed, clinging to each other. Ethan jumped from his horse and shouted for them to stay behind the wagon. He stood between the girls and the wolves, his boots sinking deep into the snow. The cold bit his face, but he didn't care. He fired until his bullets ran out. After that, there was only steel and courage. He pulled his knife from his belt as the wolves lunged. One leaped, teeth snapping. Ethan swung hard, cutting across its shoulder. Another hit his arm, tearing his coat. He kicked it away, breathing hard, feeling pain but refusing to stop. The fight seemed endless. The snow turned dark where the wolves fell. The sound of their growls mixed with his short breaths and the cries of the girls. His horse reared behind him, frightened. Ethan stood his ground. Finally, the last wolf turned and ran into the forest, limping and beaten. The others followed, leaving only silence. Ethan dropped to one knee, his chest burning, his hands shaking. His sleeve was torn, blood marking the fabric, but the cut was not deep. He looked at the girls. They were staring at him with wide eyes, shivering. One whispered something in a language he didn't know, Chinese words soft and trembling. Ethan couldn't understand, but he nodded, letting her see his calm. He tore a piece from his coat and wrapped the older girl's hand where it bled. The younger one kept holding his arm, afraid to let go. "It's all right now," Ethan said quietly. "You're safe." The words were simple, but they carried truth. He helped them climb onto his horse and walked beside it through the storm. The snow fell thicker, covering the old tracks. His cabin stood half an hour away, a small wooden place with smoke-black walls. When they reached it, he pushed the door open and guided them inside. The room was dark until he lit the fire. The flames grew fast, throwing light on the wooden walls. The girls sat near the warmth, still wrapped in fear. Ethan gave them water and a piece of bread. They ate slow, glancing at him between bites. Their faces were young, their hair black as night, and their eyes full of tears that didn't fall. He tried to ask questions, using his hands and simple words. After a few tries, the older girl managed to explain. Their wagon had broken while they were traveling with their mother. She had gone to find help but didn't come back before the wolves came. They had waited until the storm started, then tried to call for her, but only the wolves answered. Ethan listened quietly. He didn't ask more. He just placed another log on the fire and said, "You rest now. I'll keep watch." The girls lay down near the fireplace, wrapped in blankets. The firelight made their faces soft again, peaceful for the first time that night. Ethan sat by the window, his rifle back in his hands, though it was empty. The storm howled outside, beating the walls. He stared into the white darkness, feeling a strange ache in his chest. He had seen many hard winters, had fought men and nature both, but something about these two children made him feel different, like he had been given a reason to stand between the world and harm again. The hours passed slow. Every sound outside made him look up. Once he thought he saw movement near the trees, but it was only the wind playing with shadows. He kept the fire alive through the night. Before dawn, the storm began to calm. The light turned from black to gray. The girls were still sleeping, one small hand clutching the edge of his coat. Ethan smiled faintly. He stood, put on his gloves, and went outside. The air was bitter, but the snow had stopped. He could see the broken trail that led back toward the stream. Somewhere out there, the girl's mother might still be alive or maybe frozen under the white blanket of the land. Ethan couldn't leave it that way. He saddled his horse again and packed what little food he had. Before he left, he looked at the girls still sleeping by the fire. He left a note on the table in his rough handwriting. "Stay inside. I'll find your mother." He stepped out, closing the door softly behind him. The wind had slowed and the land was silent again, as if waiting. Ethan took one last look at the smoke rising from his chimney, then turned his horse toward the endless white. He rode out to find the woman whose children he had saved, knowing that whatever waited out there, he would face it the same way he faced the wolves, without fear and with all the strength he had left.